evening, everyone. My name's Catherine Conroy. I'm a project officer with Hunter Local Land Services. We're just letting everyone into the meeting room, and once that's done, we'll get going. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Mistletoe, the misunderstood woodland superhero. Thank you for all logging on and participating. We're going to have three guest speakers talking tonight. So the first one is going to be, we've swapped the order around just because we've had a bit of a technical issue, but hopefully that's going to be resolved. So Mick Roderick will speak first. He's the New South Wales Program Manager for Birdlife Australia to do with their woodland bird program. And he'll be followed by Kristy Peters, who is a project officer for Birdlife Australia working in the woodland bird program as well, and then followed by Professor Dave Watson, who is with Charles Sturt University, and he's an international expert on mistletoes, in particular Australian species of mistletoes, of which there are, I think, is still 97 species was the last total I heard. And first of all, before we get going, is like to give acknowledgement to the country on which we're meeting today. I'm sure we've got people from many different nations. I'm sitting and participating from Wanneroo country in the Upper Hunter. So I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects and recognise that we're meeting on their country today. So I'll hand over to Mick.
Thanks, Catherine, and hi everyone. Yes, so I'm Mick Roderick. I'm the New South Wales Woodland Bird Program Manager at Birdlife Australia. I'll just bring out my talk. And I'd like to acknowledge the Wabaka people, the traditional custodians of land that I'm sitting on now, but also the Wanneroo people, which are the traditional custodians and knowledge holders on the land of just about all the work that I do in the Upper Hunter and even down to the Lower Hunter. So originally Dave was going to give us an introduction on just how incredible mistletoe is. You're just going to have to take my word for it while I walk you through about mistletoe in the Hunter Valley and how it helped, how it helps shape our nationally important woodland bird assemblage. And we've got a couple of nationally threatened woodland birds that rely on mistletoe in the Hunter Valley. So just to set the scene, the Hunter Valley, there's this concept of a Western influence, meaning that there are birds and other flora and fauna from west of the divide that occur in the Hunter Valley. So the Great Dividing Range generally follows the coast, sort of parallel to the coast till it gets to the Blue Mountains. Then it swings a long way west, and at the top of the Hunter Valley, a place called woodland. The Great Dividing Range is less than 500 metres. It's only 470 metres high, and it's a long way west. It's almost as far west as Gunnedah and Narrabri. So there's these major barriers to the north with the Barrington Tops, to the south with the sandstone curtain of the Blue Mountains, and of course the ocean to the east. But this physical barrier just does not exist to the west. And so in theory, that has enabled some western species to spill over into the coastal catchment of the Hunter Valley. And you can see on that image there, I'm not sure if people can see my mouse, but you can see what I'm talking about with that sort of gap in the divide and also the low relief of the range there. And also with what we call the valley effect, that we experience some pretty severe westerly winds in the Hunter Valley, and over a long period of time, presumably those westerly winds have dried our vegetation out, such that we're now left with we now had sort of very dry open woodland habitat as opposed to wetter habitats that you might find in other coastal catchments. That's a really good image there. That really sort of drives it home, and you can see that really obvious gap in the Great Dividing Range there. So just some examples of some of these western bird species. I'm only going to mention three really, but probably the best one I think is the singing honeyeater. It's very much an inland bird. It occurs mostly in low acacia scrub across most of Australia, but almost exclusively west of the Great Dividing Range in New South Wales, and with the exception at the top of the Hunter Valley. That's a photo they're taken actually as far down as Martindale, which is actually probably closer to the coast to Ulan. Yeah, not a long way up the valley. So singing honeyeaters do occur in the Upper Hunter, and they actually breed. Probably the best known is the painted honeyeater, a mistletoe specialist. And so it's also a bird that's generally found west of the Great Dividing Range. Sometimes a bird or two will lob into Western Sydney and they might breed, but we actually get really good numbers of painted honeyeaters in some seasons. It's not unusual to have 20 or 30 birds along a major river course such as the Widden Valley in some seasons. And so you can see on that image there, this is the Hunter River, and this is the Goulburn River. So the Goulburn River forms a very large part of the Hunter Valley catchment, and that's where nearly all of the painted honeyeater records are from in the Hunter. Spiny-cheeked honeyeater is another one. Again, more sort of open, dry country west of the Divide, but is now actually very common in the Hunter. So here we have those three birds, and the lowest common denominator looking at those three images is this beautiful beast here, grey mistletoe. So I like to call grey mistletoe as the hunter's super plant from the west. And that map there shows the distribution of grey mistletoe. So it occurs mostly on inland wattles. So these lines here are botanical subdivisions. They don't actually show catchments very well. But these dots out here, I hope people can see my mouse. These are all in the Upper Hunter. And it's actually a super abundant plant in the Upper Hunter. It's just, you drive along and you see grey mistletoe everywhere. So these are examples of some of the trees like yarran and weeping mile that they usually occur in west of the Divide. But in the Upper Hunter, it's growing in Acacia linearifolia, which is an abundant tree or plant in the Upper Hunter, and with it, the grey mistletoe has proliferated. And it's become such a thing that grey mistletoe and painted honeyeaters in the Hunter are so important and so widely recognised that Hunter Local Land Service has recently commissioned Jenny McCracken to do a wonderful 3D mural in Merriwa. And I would thoroughly recommend to people that if they're passing through Merriwa on the Golden Highway, going from Newcastle to Dubbo or vice versa, to drop in and check out this fantastic mural at the skate park. So mistletoe isn't just important to those three birds, and I may have forgotten to mention that the painted honeyeater is actually listed nationally on the EPBC Act as a vulnerable species. So it's one of the few woodland birds that are listed nationally. There's a number of seabirds and shorebirds, but there aren't too many woodland birds that are actually listed on the EPBC Act. So whilst the painted honeyeater is listed as vulnerable, the regent honeyeater is critically endangered. It has a population of almost certainly less than 300 birds. It's pretty much on the brink of extinction, this bird. And as we speak, this is pretty sobering information, that we actually don't know the whereabouts of any wild regent honeyeaters right now. Middle of the breeding season, and we don't know where there's any birds. They're out there somewhere, I'm sure, but it just gives you some idea of the sort of peril that this species is in. And I'll come back to those two photos in a later slide. So just giving context to just how important mistletoe is to regent honeyeaters. In a way, I like to think that mistletoe has kind of seen regent honeyeaters through this incredibly sad bottleneck that they're going through. So just going back a few years to October 2019, here's a pair that bred along the Merriwa River, and those birds were feeding on needleleaf mistletoe, which you can see in that image. It's not particularly clear. Thanks to George Gillum for that photo. That's a adult with a juvenile there. And that year, we only actually found 5 breeding pairs across the entire range. And at least 2 of those pairs were actually nesting and feeding in needleleaf mistletoe. Then in 2020, in the Widden Valley, again in the Upper Hunter catchment, they're at it again, and there's a photo of a nest in a river she oak. And that year again, we have very few nests, only 6 or 7 nests across the entire range. And again, mistletoe featured, with birds nesting in needleleaf mistletoe, or near needleleaf mistletoe that is flowering. So fast forward to last year, we actually had, would you believe, 5 nests along a stretch of river along the Merriwell River where that photo from 2019 was taken. 4 of those 5 nests were successful. And yep, there wasn't any eucalypt flower. The birds were subsisting almost entirely on mistletoe blossom. And there's a great photo there from Leah Murphy of one of the parent birds feeding a young. So this is literally last spring, 5 nests, and there were many other nests also last year in mistletoe. And Capity Valley was once considered the stronghold for the Regent Honeyeater. Whenever birds weren't nesting elsewhere, it was a kind of a case of, oh, it's okay because at least they're nesting in the Capity. Birds have really struggled to nest successfully in the Capities since 2017. That was the last good season. And in the last 2 seasons out there, the only successful nests in the Capity Valley have been nests that have been around needle-leaf mistletoe. So that gives some context to how important the mistletoe is in sort of more inland, drier environments. But mistletoe is also very important to Regent Honeyeaters locally. When I say locally, I mean in the Lower Hunter. So the long-flowered mistletoe is it's a mistletoe that grows in a place called the Tamalpam woodlands. It grows in spotted gums right through the range of the spotted gum tree, but it's of importance to Regent Honeyeaters in the Tamalpam woodlands. So it provides one of the 2 key food resources for Regent Honeyeaters when they come to the Tamalpam woodlands to breed. Apart from the mistletoe, the other is the broad-leaved ironbark, Eucalyptus fibrosa. So you may have noticed in my photos before, 2018 was missing. So 2018 was a very unusual year. We couldn't actually find Regent Honeyeaters anywhere during our standardised monitoring that we do. We cover, along with ANU, we cover roughly 1,400 sites twice during the breeding season at their usual haunts, looking for birds that are breeding. We didn't find any nests, any evidence of breeding in 2018. That was until late November when we found birds in the Tamalpam woodlands, and lo and behold, the birds were both feeding on and nesting in a long-flowered mistletoe. Then last year, we did a captive release. So we did a release of zoo-bred birds into the Tamalpam woodlands. So the Regent Honeyeater is in such dire trouble that we are actually breeding them in zoos, I guess, first of all, to make sure they don't go extinct full stop. So they will still exist in zoos. Hopefully it'll never come to that. But we also breed them in zoos to supplement the wild population by releasing zoo-bred birds every so often. So we did that in the Tamalpam woodlands last year. And we had a number of instances of birds feeding in the long-flowered mistletoe again. That female there is a first-year bird. We call her anvil tail. You can look at her tail feather there, which is quite unique. In fact, she's got a really unique molt, that bird, but she raised young. She's a wild bird, and there she is getting stuck into the needle-leaf mistletoe. The long-flowered mistletoe. So the take-home from all of this, that mistletoe is important for birds generally, as Dave will convince you of more later. But I guess my point in my talk is to really drive home just how remarkably important it is in the Hunter Valley in particular for 2 species that are nationally listed as threatened, one of them on the brink of extinction, that really, to be fair, has almost been relying on mistletoe for the last 4 breeding seasons. So that'll do for me. I think I stuck to my 10 minutes. So
Thank you, Mick.
I hope I was sharing all that time. Because I don't have the option to stop sharing, that's all. Somebody stop sharing for me.
Yep. We'll hand over to Kristy and hear what she's got to tell us.
Are you guys seeing that okay?
Yes.
Yep.
I am.
Okay, good.
Yeah, all good.
Oh, have I gone back to my notes here?
Yeah, you have, yeah.
Wait a minute, sorry.
You're right.
Okay, all right. Hello everyone. I'm a Woodland Birds project coordinator with Birdlife Australia. I work with Mick in the Newcastle area in the Tamalpin woodlands, as Mick was just mentioning. And one of my key roles is to actually coordinate restoration of long-flowered mistletoe in these woodlands. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the project we've been working on over the last few years. So one of the most important things about this project is that it's a great partnership project. There's lots of different organisations and community members involved. And this is just a lovely photo at that captive release that Mick just mentioned in 2021. So in the middle there is Tara Deva, the CEO of Minderibba Local Aboriginal Land Council, and Mick on the right there, and then on the left is Lucas Grenadier from the Department of Planning and Environment. So we're thankful for this project that Minderibba have let us work on their land. They've welcomed us onto Wanneroo country. And we've developed a really lovely relationship working with them over the last few years on this project, but probably over the last 7 or 8 years that Mick's been out there doing bird surveys and working on regent honeyeaters. So we're lucky to have received quite a bit of funding, government funding over the last few years to keep this project running. So just listing there, acknowledging some of the funding support that we've received. And as Mick mentioned, so the superhero plant on the east coast is the long-flowered mistletoe, and it's spring flowering. And Dave will tell you all more about this, but it's hemiparasitic. I'll leave that for Dave to explain what that means. But this is a photo taken from the Tamalpin woodlands near Kurri Kurri, and it's growing on its main host tree, the spotted gum. So unfortunately, at the Tamalpin woodlands, there's been a series of quite intense fires over the last few years, particularly in 2016 and 2017 fire seasons. And mistletoe, unfortunately, is killed outright when it's burnt. It doesn't regenerate after fire, unlike a lot of our native plant species in Australia. And that means we've got to wait until primary seed dispersers like the mistletoe bird or the painted honeyeater that Mick was just talking about spread that seed back into these burnt areas from adjoining unburnt areas. But unfortunately, that doesn't really happen in a very fast way in nature, because mistletoe birds generally focus their foraging efforts on areas that have lots of fruiting mistletoe. So in areas where it's been killed off, we're trying a project out where we're trying to plant the mistletoe ourselves, and that's going to fast track this natural process occurring. And then once we get it back in there, the mistletoe birds will hopefully be attracted to come back in and then help us out. So as I said, it's a great partnership project. We acknowledge all the photos in these presentations, the courtesy of Minderibba Lauk, and we're very grateful that we get to work in this beautiful patch of bush. So this is the project site. If you're familiar with, so I've got the little inset map there showing you that we're to the west of Newcastle, about 35 k's to the west of Newcastle there. And this is the largest intact remnant, or pretty much intact remnant on the valley floor, and it's lowland woodland. And we've lost, up to 85% of our woodland habitat along the east coast of Australia. And this particular patch is home to many threatened species, flora, fauna, like quite a lot of woodland bird species occur here, and a lot of the vegetation communities are threatened communities as well, like the one that there's the spotted gum ironbark that Mick was mentioning. This area also has a really complicated land ownership. So we have, you can see the green there, there's some existing national park, but the majority of the area where those yellow dots are, where the regent honeyeater records are, they occur on private land. So some of it, is protected in that Minderibba Lauk don't have any plans to develop that land and hold it for conservation purposes. But quite a lot of it you can see. I'll see if you can see my cursor there, but just where I'm pointing to, this development with the road going in has been known in the past as the Hunter Economic Zone, recently rebranded to the Hunter Energy Zone, and a lot of different developments have been proposed there. We're really hoping that no further development goes ahead, because as you can see, it's a key place for where we find regent honeyeaters, both during the non-breeding season and the breeding season when we have the right flowering conditions. So this is just to show you the large expanses that were burnt, and they were burnt quite badly. And you can see that they do cover a lot of the areas where we've found regent honeyeaters there. And this is just to show you just how bad the fires were. They really did burn everything right nearly up to the tips of the canopy. And it had a profound impact at this site, killing over 90% of the mistletoe where these fires burnt. So we really did, this site really took a hit with what we've lost there from the mistletoe side of things. So just got another couple of photos. These are very famous photos that Mick had in his presentation, but as he said, it's a key resource for the regent honeyeater for foraging and nesting, and the site of 2 modern breeding events with lots of birds recruited into the wild there. So the Tamalpam woodlands is really considered at the moment to be the key breeding area in New South Wales for this species. So the project that we're doing is believed to be a world first. We've done a large-scale inoculation of host trees within the burnt section of the Tamalpam woodlands. We started in 2020 and we're still going we went through to early 2022, and then I'll tell you about some funding that we've just received to continue on with this project. So what we're hoping to do is supercharge the native woodland ecosystem and hopefully keep those regent honeyeaters coming back to breed there. And Dave's going to mention this in his presentation, but there's been some really interesting research come out about how important mistletoe is for as a drought resource, and also forests that contain it are climate change refuges for threatened bird species like the regent honeyeater. So you'll talk a little bit more about mistletoe and drought later on. So basically what we've done baseline surveys to look at the burnt and unburnt areas. We did actually try to start this back in June 2022, but we're now learning about mistletoe that it can be a bit fickle with the phenology. Some years it'll fruit really well and be really abundant, and then other years, like in 2020, I think just as we're coming out of the drought, we could barely find any. We scraped together about 80 pieces of fruit and got them planted. But thankfully in the coming years, once that drought broke and we've had all this rain, each year now we're getting an abundance of seed. It's more not so much limited by fruiting, it's just limited by the availability of our arborists and our team to get out there and plant as much as we can get up. So we've now started monitoring, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that's going later. But we also do bird surveys in paired control and treatment sites, which will be a really nice data set in the future to see how this project is tracking and the effects of the mistletoe being put back into these ecosystems. So just a couple of photos to show we've picked and planted over 2,000 seeds now over a couple of years. And just showing you here, you can see the arborist there. He's just popping the seed out, planting it on the underside of a branch. And this is basically just mimicking what a mistletoe bird would do in nature. So where they would poop out the seed, wipe it onto a branch, and it'll basically attach there. We're just popping it out ourselves, and you can even see down in this bottom photo, a little ants come along to sort of look at the sugar, because there's a lot of sugar content in the fruit itself that the birds like. So yeah, he's just coming to check out what this little thing is that we've just planted there, and it's just showing that we're marking the seeds so we can actually come back and see when they've germinated. And I'm just going to quickly see if I can play this. This is just showing you how talented the group of arborists that we have are that work for us. They get up these trees so quickly. I've actually tried this, and it was very embarrassing. It did not look anything like this. So once they get the line over, which is probably the tricky bit, throwing a weighted line over the branch they want to climb up, they just walk up so easily. So they're amazing to work with, and you can see those couple of clumps there that one of the guys is going up to pick from. So we need to get the mistletoe up high like this for regent honeyeaters to have those nesting sites and foraging locations in the future. So this is just showing you there. This is the nice ripe fruit that we've picked ready to plant. So if you wanted to actually plant your own, you could give this a go in your garden. So you can source some ripe fruit, just have a look around your local area, see if you can spot a clump of mistletoe and wait for some ripe fruit. If you can, remove it with the stalk still attached, so you stop the process of it actually germinating, because once air gets in there, it'll actually start to germinate. But if you're going to pick and plant on the same day, that's fine. Just basically pick it. You can keep it for a short time in the fridge, just in your Ziploc bag, and then basically go out and get planting, and just wipe it on an underside of a small branch. And I'm sure that Dave will tell you this too, mistletoe planting is a numbers game. About 90% will germinate, but only about 10% will become mature plants. So it's really get as much out there as you can. Don't really worry too much about putting a fair bit in one tree, because they're not all going to survive. And then this is to show you that it does actually work. So I've got a little image up the top there to show you when they get their 2 little cotyledons, those little early emergent leaves. So that's just showing it probably, I'd say, a couple of months after it's germinated. And then we went back 7 to 9 months post those plantings that we did. And we found we've had about a 13% survival rate. This is actually quite good in the world of mistletoe, because many will they'll be sloughed off through bark shed, they'll be predated by possums, birds, insects, that type of thing. So especially with things like a spotted gum, a smooth bark tree that sheds its bark annually, it's important to think about bark shed timing if you're going to be doing mistletoe planting. And we found it's definitely a great idea to plant on the underside or the side of small, vigorous branches. Planting in junctions wasn't particularly very good. We didn't find, a lot of the time, that was where a lot of bark was shed from. Epicormic branches, it's tempting to plant down low on spotted gums, where you can actually do it yourself and don't need an arborist, but actually a lot of those branches, they actually fall off later as the tree gets taller. So yeah, it's great if you can get up a bit higher to those vigorous branches. Just showing here, we held a lovely knowledge sharing workshop back in April of this year, 2022. And this is just showing the group of people that were on Wanneroo country to actually talk about the cultural and ecological significance of these woodlands. We all did a lovely painting to sort of signify the knowledge that was shared on the day. And it was just really special to be out there with Wanneroo elders, learning from them, and then sharing our knowledge from an ecology perspective of what occurs out there, and what we're doing with the Mistletoe project. And yes, the word is definitely spreading of the work that we've done. I know that Catherine has sent around a flyer that was made with Hunter Local Land Services, but we've also been on the cover of Audubon magazine, a very famous ornithological magazine based in the United States, and Australian Geographic has done a feature that did talk about our mistletoe project. So the word is getting out there. So I'd love for you to all tell people about the benefits of planting mistletoe, and you can get that brochure in that link that Catherine sent. So just acknowledging our talented arborists and all of the organisations that have made this project possible. The New South Wales Environmental Trust has just recently granted us 3 more years of funding, so we can continue planting mistletoe throughout the Hunter Valley. So thank you very much for listening.
So I'll hand over to Dave, and he can tell you the ins and outs or the secret life of mistletoe. Who knew?
Thanks, Catherine. Good day, everyone. And thanks for coming along virtually to hear us babble on about these weird plants. So I'm going to give you a little rundown onto the broader sort of background around mistletoes, how they do what they do. Because technology is a wonderful thing, we like to try things a bit differently this time. So I'm going to need to say next each time the slide is advanced. So next.
Oh, there we go.
So lots of this kind of work does not happen just by one person alone. So many people have been involved in this. I should say I'm coming to you from Roderick country, unceded land, and recognise the tremendous contribution of First Nations people and their Indigenous leaders, past, present, and emerging. Next slide, please. So I'm a professor of ecology at Charles Sturt. I work on a range of different projects. Mistletoe is one of the hats that I wear, but I wear a few others, including acoustic stuff. I do a lot of work in the arid zone, and I've got a few ongoing projects in Latin America as well. Next slide, please. But mistletoe is my favourite child, and I've got ongoing work in a range of different capacities. That central photo there with the red flowers, that's a new mistletoe we've found in Colombia, working with mixed media artists, all sorts of fun stuff. So yeah, what you're seeing now is just a little glimpse into a big rambling house that is my mistletoe program. Next, please. So this is where we're going. I'll give you a quick rundown on a few things on mistletoes, really point out two of the main things that they do in terms of their effects on diversity, and that's with insectivores and litter, and with nectar feeders and nectar. So really picking up on the really innovative work that Kristy was summarising just before. Talk about management. What do you do when there's too much? What do you do when there's not enough? And then hopefully plenty of time for questions. Next. So this is a tasting platter. Yep, you get the idea. Grab a bunch, move on. Next, please. Okay, so please don't think that you're don't feel bad if you think all these things are the case. They're not the case. Those are all misconceptions. So let's bust a few myths about mistletoes. Firstly, they're introduced weeds, aren't they? No, they're not. Next slide, please. They're locals. They're as local as kangaroos and emus. There's a bunch of them around the world. There's 97 in Australia. Just found a new one, that picture there in WA. That's a new Lysiana. Doesn't have a name yet. So we'll get to 100. We'll crack that century in the next 5 or 10 years, no problem at all. Next one. Aren't they really toxic? Like little Johnny had some mistletoe. Is that going to be a problem? Au contraire. Good food, very tasty. Recommend it. I can give you recipes. Don't they kill trees? That's a big one. I field a lot of calls on this. Mistletoes kill trees around as frequently as fleas kill dogs. I mean, it does happen, but it's a pretty crook dog if a few fleas are going to knock it off. And that's the same with mistletoe and trees. Trees, a healthy tree is what a mistletoe needs. A mistletoe has no interest in killing the tree that it's attached to, literally biting the hand that feeds it. So they can have effects on growth. They can have effects on vigour, especially during times of shortage like droughts. And then the last one about sick trees, we found actually the reverse. That doing a lot of inoculation experiments, like Kristy has pointed out, you're doing in the Hunter. If you put a bunch of seeds on a bunch of plants, it's only really those vigorous trees that have abundant resources to share that end up hosting mistletoe to maturity. If the tree's struggling to pay the bills, there's no spare change left for the mistletoe. Next one. So this is a quick romp through. Just a reminder to pause and reflect on the fact that these are a gorgeous group of native plants. Like, look around your garden, you'll have kangaroo paws, you'll have bottle brush, you'll have all sorts of cool things. And you might think of Australia as a pretty special place in terms of native flora. Mistletoes are one of those groups that I think are right up there in terms of one of the really interesting components of our flora that you just don't see in other parts of the world. Most other mistletoes are a bit skanky. Our mistletoes are, well, they're gorgeous. Next. And if you want to know more about these plants, this is a very quick romp through. It's all in the book. CSIRO Publishing, your friends, your family, that weird neighbour down the road, they all deserve a copy. Next. So very quickly, mistletoes aren't just one thing. They're multiple groups of plants that have evolved independently from root parasitic ancestors. And so this is a very complicated diagram showing you a family tree of all the mistletoes of the world. When it finally renders, there we go. And the green there is mistletoes. The purple are root parasitic plants. So a lot of those details are superfluous. Just understand that the things we call mistletoes have evolved independently 5 times. There's 5 families of plants we call mistletoes, and these guys, the mammals, were involved in their origins and early diversification. They're currently dispersed by birds. Oh, spewing dog, just a sec. Maggie. All right, rescued. But we rely on, they rely on birds now, but mammals were the the selective force that drove the evolution of mistletoes to begin with, way back before birds were even a thing. So mistletoes actually predate birds. Just give your mind a chance to expand to accommodate that fact. Next. So let's look at effects of mistletoe on diversity, a question dear to my heart. Next slide, please. So we did a large experiment to look at this. It's a bit perverse, but in order to really quantify how important something is, a really useful way to do that is to take it away. And there's an idea out there that mistletoe acts as something called a keystone, an ecological keystone. So we looked, and the cassowary is a classic example of that. It supports a forest full of diverse animals. It's the only bird large enough to disperse a lot of those large seeded rainforest fruits. So a classic example of a keystone, just one bird of 300 you might find in New Guinea or Cape York, but take that one bird away and there's nothing dispersing all those trees. The forest becomes lower diversity if they go away. So next slide. So we did this in southern New South Wales, just up the road from where I am now, near the town, centred on the town of Holbrook. Those little red dots there are 40 woodlands on private land in box-gum grassy woodland. Next slide. We did a bunch of work surveying who lives in these places, and then, next slide, took mistletoe away. See the mistletoe there? Oh, yep, and click the button, and oh, mistletoe gone. Yep, okay. So we did that thousands and thousands of times, removed tons of mistletoe from, next slide, from half the woodlands, left the other woodlands alone, and demonstrated, wow, it really is an ecological keystone. Take mistletoe away, do nothing else, just leave it where it falls, you lose a third of your birds within 3 years. Species, a third of your birds just go away. And so that's, you know, there's a few keystones out there, killer whales, those cute little sea otters, they, you know, they're cellar dwellers compared to mistletoe in terms of its ecological effects. Mistletoe has 174 times greater an effect on diversity than you'd expect based on its biomass in the woodlands we studied. So it's really important stuff. Next, please. And this was interesting. Many parts of the world think mistletoe is kind of interesting to begin with. So when this study was published, the media got very excited. Next, please. But we were still concerned because we really wanted to work out the mechanism, because when we looked at it, it wasn't the birds we're expecting. It wasn't those nectar feeders or the fruit eaters or the things that like to nest in mistletoe. It was insect eaters that did all the heavy lifting. So that big arrow there, those dots on the graph to the left, that's just summaries of diversity before and after, so proportional change in diversity in those sites where we took mistletoe away, the red sites, and the blue sites, those sites we just, oh, sorry, I got that wrong. Sorry, the blue sites is where we took mistletoe away treatment, and the red sites, the controls, doing nothing else, bang, lose all that diversity, and that's all driven by insectivores. Take the insectivore pattern away, there's no difference between those red and blue dots directly beneath the shrike thrush there. And not just any insectivores, but ground foraging insectivores. So we've got this perverse situation where we see this really pervasive effect of this plant on bird communities, but the birds most affected don't do anything with mistletoe. They're stooging around on the ground. So this is a real unscratchable, and we just had to look further, had to do some more work. Next slide. And so for this, we needed to think a bit more about the birds. We know what these ground foraging birds are up against. They're in real trouble. We call them declining woodland birds for a reason. They're not thriving. They're shrinking back to inland parts of their range, to northern parts of their range, things that were previously very common around here, where I'm sitting now. Things like great-crowned babblers, they're just not around anymore. Those ground foraging birds are the ones that seem to be most sensitive to mistletoe, and they're telling us something. Next slide. And so really, rather than thinking about it from a bird's point of view, next slide, we needed to think about it from an insect's point of view. Next slide. So we did a bunch of experiments, small-scale experiments, not giant woodland experiments, lots of numbers. The key thing there is some insects are preferred food by insectivores. We call them tasties. Next slide. Once you mix around litter and look at what kind of insects do you find in mistletoe litter as opposed to just eucalypt litter, so looking beneath trees with mistletoes in them and trees without mistletoes in them, you find a buttload more tasty insects beneath those infected trees. Next slide. So all those numbers, 2.5 million is a big number. Adding mistletoe to the canopy of woodlands at around 7 to 10 plants to the hectare, not high densities, and you've got 2.5 million little insectivore snacks per hectare per year. So if you're a manager of a landscape and you're concerned about particular critters and you've got the lever that you can reach for that says more food please, well, you're going to yank on that lever. And so mistletoe is most definitely very influential as far as that particular pathway goes. Mistletoe litter falls down, nutrients, lots of insects, gobble it up. So the pathway is now very clear, but at the start it was a really mysterious pattern. Next slide, please. That's fine, that's detail, lots of bugs. Next slide. So it might seem a bit of a strange link that insectivorous birds are ground foraging litter layer, but this is feeding into a much broader pattern we're seeing about woodlands and about productivity and the real important roles that coarse woody debris, that burrowing animals, and that soil health play in our woodland ecosystems. And interestingly, you'll be seeing many reports about global insect declines. So that's all part of this as well. And so the reason why so many insectivores are in trouble is, their prey, the insects, are just becoming scarcer and scarcer as those rich littery woodlands are converted to scorched earth, car parks, and housing developments. Next. So there's a known pathway now that's been replicated by many studies worldwide showing that mistletoe litter is worth its weight in pickled onions. It's great stuff. It's full of goodies. It's enriched cations. Australian soils are terrible, and many of the nutrients that plants struggle to find are actually bound up in their tissues, and mistletoe releases that as a parasite. It slurps it out and drops it in the feeding zone of the plant. In that time, microbes, fungi, all those litter munching invertebrates can have a crack at it, and that then really supercharges food webs from the bottom up. Next slide, please. So that's a quick view about one particular pathway that it took 20 years to unravel. And one of the secrets to understanding how it works so effectively is because mistletoe isn't just random. It's not just one here, one there. You get it in patches. You get it in patches at multiple scales, from landscape scales. Some areas have lots, some areas have none, right down to individual trees. One tree has a lot, none of those other trees do. And that leads to this small scale patchiness in nutrient availability. Directly beneath the mistletoe, there'll be 10 times more potassium, 5 times more calcium, 6 times more magnesium than 2 meters that way. And that's the kind of thing that drives diversity in little things. Soil microbial fauna, insects, and herbaceous plants. Next. I'll skip this. Next, please. So that's one interaction. There's many other interactions involving mistletoe. Things nest in it. There's lots of insects that only feed on it. Lots of animals move it around, as Mick mentioned, with the sticky seeds. Next slide. One thing I want to focus on though is the nectar, and so some very recent work published this year looked at nectar feeding birds across southeastern Australia. 2,000 and 2,100 monitoring sites, so massive effort. Next slide. Over about a 5-year period, and found a bunch of things. Found that during a drought, mistletoe was the most reliable nectar source, even though it's a minor component in these woodlands. You got dominance of various eucalyptus species. When they're not flowering during a drought, the only shop open is mistletoe. And so many of the nectar feeding birds, including region honeyeaters, they're dependent on that one group of plants. Next slide. But the troubling thing is, as the drought wore on, those mistletoes just curled up their toes and died. So this same study that found, those freaky little plants, they're really important for nectar feeders. Oh yeah, during droughts. And oh yeah, but if the drought keeps going, yeah, they all die, those freaky little plants. So you've got nectar feeders that kind of backed into a corner and then really are running out of options. So there's some genuine concerns about not just regents as an individual species, but the broader nectar feeding community, and what that means in terms of their pollination services. And if these eucalypts aren't getting pollinated, then the whole system starts to break down. So there's some real concerns about this work. Next slide. So this is led by Ross Crates and the ANU team. Mick was involved in this work, as well as a cast of thousands there. If you want more information about that. And we're seeing similar work in Chile as well. So it's not just an Australian thing. You can have too much of a good thing. And there are things you can do if you're driving down the road and you see that, so, oh, that's not right. That tree is not happy. If there's more mistletoe there than the tree can support, that tree is going to have a bad time. But what you're seeing there is a symptom of a much larger series of issues, not actually to do with mistletoe, but to do with the factors that would normally keep mistletoe in check. And in your part of the world, as in at my end, brush-tailed possums and occasional fire are the two main factors that keep mistletoe numbers in check. And some mistletoe munching insects as well. And so if there's no hollows around, if there's just open ground the possums aren't going to cross, you're going to get mistletoe numbers building up and up and up, and there's nothing to check them. So you can spend a lot of money, go in there and snip them off, but 5 years' time they'll be back again. So addressing that through broader scale restoration, getting hollows and hollow-bearing trees back into the landscape, getting nectar-bearing shrubs that support butterflies back into the landscape, and the occasional cool burn that our traditional owners can really, teach us more about is critical to getting things much more in balance. I'm conscious of time. Let me just zip through this last little aspect. It's a quick and dirty. Next slide. Okay, so we've tried putting mistletoe back into a landscape that doesn't have any. This is Melbourne. Next slide, please. And looking at that canopy of plane trees, Tim Flannery's quote comes to mind. He reckons that plane trees are so useless for Australian wildlife. He's going to shout the entire bar if someone brings him a leaf showing signs of insect herbivory. So next slide. So we took that as a challenge and said, yeah, righto, but you can make them better. You don't have to replace them. A nice, fully mature 50-year-old tree, it's going to take a long time to replace. And there's a lot of them in Melbourne. That's the highlighted area there. So next slide. How about we plonk mistletoe in them? And not just any mistletoe. We wanted to go for a mistletoe that climbs on the trunk rather than slurps on the canopy, because premature branch fall for that Ferrari, that's paperwork nobody needs. So we went for that species instead that clings to the trunk. So that's Muellerina. You might be familiar with it, those naturalists out there. It's creeping mistletoe. Instead of just one connection to the host, it has multiple connections and it can actually move through the tree chasing sunlight. So we planted a bunch of seeds. Next slide. And the media got involved. They loved this. Gardening Australia. Oh my gosh. And we get some signage. We were expecting a lot of blowback from the public about, oh, terrible, kills trees, what are you doing? And it was the reverse. The PR department was loving it. People were like, can you do it in my garden? Can you do it in my park? People are loving it. So the message is getting through, even for Melburnians. That's a tough crowd. Next slide. So that's what our babies look like, remarkably similar to Kristy's babies. Next. And then this year, in June, 5 years after we planted the seeds, I did the proper follow-up next. And this is the first time that mistletoe has been large-scale inoculated in a city before. So I thought, look, let's live tweet the whole, extravaganza. And there's one. There is a baby. It's about the size of a football. We put it there. Yay, warm in a glow. Next. But there's more and there's fruit. So we haven't just added them to the landscape. They're now taking care of themselves. And so of the 26 trees we inoculated back in 2017, 5 of them now have mistletoes in them, and they're now fruiting and contributing fruit to the next generation. Interestingly, 4 of those 5 trees had possum collars fitted on them, so strong evidence that possums are one of the factors limiting mistletoe recruitment in certainly this urban landscape. Next. And just where we're going from here, there's some very interesting work that we're doing looking at microclimates, and as well as food, as well as shelter and structure, litter and nectar, tasty fruit, all that good stuff, and the patchiness of nutrients. So they do a lot already. There's more. They add cool spots to the canopies of trees. They're always transpiring. They're always shedding water vapor, especially when it's very hot and very dry. Owls know this. You'll see right in the middle of your screen there's a boobook owl during a 45-degree day, just hanging out in a giant wire-leaf mistletoe. Adding mistletoes to tree canopies changes the whole canopy microclimate by about 15 degrees when it's especially dry. And so we're looking at what that means for animal persistence in landscapes, but also in terms of urban heat island effects. You've already got a lot of trees in your city. If we add mistletoes to them in a controlled way, could that be an extra element of making our cities more livable as heat waves unfortunately become more of a thing? Next slide. So wrapping up, key messages, take a moment. Mistletoe, it's good stuff. Yeah, who knew? Good stuff. Lots of litter, lots of nectar, cool spots and hot canopies, boost resources, not just out in the bush, but also in urban systems. And you can grow your own, and we can tell you how. So thanks so much for your attention, and happy to field any questions you might have.
Thanks, Dave, Mick and Kristy. So I'm sure listening to all those interesting things that all 3 speakers have been talking about, you'd have some questions.
If there's anything else that comes up afterwards, feel free to email Catherine, and we can get some answers off to you after this.
Can I ask Dave a question? while there's silence. Do ringtails browse on the foliage, or is it just brushies?
Okay, they do, but not often. They nest. They use the clumps as dray sites. So they do like hanging out in them. So do koalas. They eat them very rarely, whereas brush-tailed possums, it's one of their favourite foods. Yellow-bellied gliders, greater gliders occasionally snack on them as well. But from all the data that's around, and not even bowbucks, it's brushies. It's common brush-tailed possums are really the one. But I think in some systems, some butterfly larvae, some caterpillars, especially those showy Jezebels, they're going to be pretty important controlling factors in some systems, because if 2 or 3 females lay their eggs on one mistletoe clump, those caterpillars will defoliate the entire clump in a short space of time. And I guess the thing to bear in mind about herbivory and also fire, mistletoes are weird because they've got no storage organs. They've got no roots. They've got no ability to store carbs. They're like a really scrawny greyhound. They've got no storage at all. So if they lose their leaves, if they can't make sugar anymore, if they can't feed themselves, even though they're parasitic, they need to make their own sugar. They're just taking water from the host. So no leaves, dead mistletoe.
Gabrielle, I actually think I can enable your microphone. So I haven't seen a question go in the chat. So let's have a whirl and see if this works. And you might be able to ask your question live to the guests.
Hey, thanks so much. I had a question about the inoculation of the London plane trees. Given that they're deciduous and go into dormancy, does that have any impact on the hemiparasitic plants?
Oh, great question. Clearly a student of plant physiology. Yeah, it was a bit of a suck it and see. So there's been some work done on mistletoes in New Zealand growing on exotic deciduous hosts, and even though they're used to growing on evergreen trees where the light environment stays roughly the same year in, year out, they're able to basically switch on and really crank out photosynthate for half the year when they're exposed, and then just sit quietly and do very little when they're completely shaded. So the growth rate's very slow. So it went from a seed to about a football-sized plant in 5 years. So they're not speedy, but it was a calculated risk, and it seems to have paid off. But it's a remarkable example of just how resilient and how adaptive they are, that they can handle that kind of completely different host architecture and still manage to work things out.
Wow, that's phenomenal, all in the one generation as well.
Yep, respect.
Thank you, Gabrielle. We've got a question come through the Q&A, so hopefully it is working for some of you. So from Ali, thank you. How advanced does a tree need to be before it can be inoculated with mistletoe?
Yeah, I'm happy to hear Kristy's thoughts on this as well, but I'd say it wants to be sort of as thick as your leg. You want a chunky tree. You don't want. I mean, why would you burden an up and comer with extra bills to pay? So I think you're looking at as thick as your leg, thereabouts. So at least 10 years, 10, 12 years old for most ukes. Maybe a bit less for some of the speedy growing acacias. But it needs to be a fully formed tree, not an actively growing tree. Otherwise, very low success rates, and it can really change the architecture of the tree. But I'm keen to hear from Kristy on her thoughts.
Look, we have had some good success on smaller trees, like only sort of, I don't know, here, like this kind of, I don't know, 10 centimetre to 20 centimetre DBH type thing. But we're calling those reference trees because we really don't know. We've gone back and looked and done some monitoring on lower branches where we've just been able to wipe them on. And we've had some really good success. There was a small tree that we went back to that actually, I think 8 out of the seeds planted, 5 germinated. And they're all looking fantastic at the moment. But then I was interested to hear that, I know that long-flowered mistletoe is a faster grower than the creeping mistletoe. But I'm just wondering how long these particular ones that we planted on these small trees will last, whether they're branches that are going to end up falling off as the tree grows, or whether they're actually going to, keep growing at the rate that they're growing. So I'll hopefully find out in the next couple of years.
And I guess one of the things to think about with mistletoe inoculation, especially this project in the Hunter, is it's not about making the food source. It's about training the local seed dispersers. Oi, there's mistletoe here. Come and say hello, spread the love, and then they'll take care of it for you. So really it's trying to just recalibrate the system so that those existing dispersers, those existing ecological partnerships, spring back into life again.
Yes, definitely.
Just on that, so in the Kapiti Valley, we've been doing tree planting for the Regent Honeyeater since 1993, and it's been mostly eucalypts, obviously, with a bit of a few shrubs and stuff thrown in. One of the properties that we've planted on, we've actually planted across 3 different years, and at that property there have been mistletoes appear in trees planted as recently, I think it's 2009. So, around 13, well, actually, but at the time that we were looking at the plants, they would have only been 10 years old. And the trees didn't seem to be bothered at all. And of interest, we had that, out of 25 sites, I think it was number 2 or 3 for bird diversity. So obviously there must be a mistletoe bird or 2 that are in that part of the Kapiti Valley depositing mistletoes in these really young ukes that have resulted in an amazing result for birds. So yeah, anecdotal but interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Darcy, in the participants there, I saw you had your hand up. Feel free to go ahead if you still had a question.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Hey, yeah, Mick just sort of answered it, but yeah, I was a bush regener, and I was just wondering like how early on in the regen you would try and get them in. But yeah, you sort of said they can handle them when they're fairly young. Yeah, so.
Well, I mean, like that was only one site in one planting program, and it was box mistletoe. So perhaps other mistletoes in other ukes, it might be a different result. So I can't really give a definitive answer. I guess the other thing, Kristy, is that one of the places where we've got a proliferation of mistletoe around Cessnock and Curry places associated with the Hunter Expressway, which I think opened in about 2015. And a lot of the landscaped on-ramps and off-ramps and rest areas have young spotted gums that are only going to be about less than 10 years old anyway, that are full of mistletoe, full of the long-flowered mistletoe. And the spotted gums, they are showing absolutely no sign of any stress. So, again, it's all anecdotal. Don't take that as gospel, but from those two examples, it seems that a youngish tree can handle, I mean, to be fair, most of those spotted gums have probably only got 1 or 2 clumps. They definitely haven't got a large number of clumps in them. So I don't, I think Dave would agree that maybe run an experiment, maybe, have a section of your planting where you, at year 5, you plant a number of mistletoes in your trees, see what happens. So, because we don't know this stuff, do we? Yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Got another question in the chat, guys, from Christine. Thank you. If regents don't have 5 years to wait, and yet it takes that long for mistletoe growth, what else can be done?
I'll fill that one. So this is a very contemporary issue. A population viability analysis was done earlier this year, led again by Ross Crates and the ANU team, but using data from Birdlife and other people. And that population viability analysis, which is basically it's a diagnosis of the future of a species. It concluded that if we did nothing, it'd go extinct within 10 years, hands down. And so it identified 3 actions that we could do to actually keep the bird going. One is a bit of a no-brainer, protecting known breeding habitat. One of the other ones was to do releases of zoo-bred birds. Now, I did mention that in our in my talk, and that's something that is happening as we speak. Don't air that too widely, because there is a media release coming out this weekend about that, but there is one happening right now. One happened last year. So, as I said, things are that serious for this bird that we actually are now relying almost on the release of zoo-bred birds to supplement the very low wild population. The other thing that we need to do is to facilitate breeding. Regent honeyeaters, their modus operandi is to function as a flocking bird. They used to breed in semi-communal flocks along river courses and things. Nowadays, you're lucky to find one nest in an entire region, and that one nest is obviously very susceptible to a range of threats. We spend a lot of money on the Regent honeyeater, and all that money, all that effort, there must be maybe 50 to 100 people working on Regent honeyeaters. All the work that we do can be undone by a pied currawong flying off with a couple of nestlings in the nest that we're trying to get the bird to breed in. So that the bird really is at the mercy of so many things, purely because of the critically low numbers. It's the critically low population which is what's putting this bird at the risk. I mean, all the stuff that came before, I mean, I'm not going to say it's irrelevant, but we really, really need to get this bird to breed now. That's where it's at.
Thank you, Mick. Kevin, I saw you had your hand up, so I'll go to you in just a moment. There's just 2 questions on the chat. So firstly from Bo, thank you. Dave, anecdotally, I've heard from reliable sources of instances where needle leaf mistletoe have been observed as dead, late 2020, but the same plant subsequently found to be at least recovering. Are there certain species of mistletoe that are exceptions to the rule of if it's crispy, it's toast?
Great, and yes, as with the inoculation experiments and looking at what grows on small trees, there's a lot we don't know, and so those anecdotal instances are often gold mines about what's possible. So the rule is that mistletoes can't handle fire, but there's one species in the Kimberley that can. The rule is that mistletoes can handle being defoliated. I've seen what you've described yourself with another species on mulga mistletoe, Lysiana murrayi, that lifeless, dead apparently, and yet back out it comes. So they can. Their physiologies are quite plastic, and they can take 15-20% of their carbohydrate budget from the host. They can slurp a little bit of phloem as well as that xylem. But I think as a rule, think of them as water parasites, and if they can't make their own carbs, they're out of options. But yeah, nature is full of exceptions. So great observation.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Bo. So to Ali now, are there any good educational programs you know of that worked with farmers to debunk those myths you talked about, Dave?
Yeah, a few. So I've had a few chats with farmer groups. I did one recently in East Gippsland that went really well to just speak directly with people who are concerned about this. Often in the pastoral and livestock raising industries rather than croppers. And there's some promotion, some educational material around that LLS, Hunter LLS has got some really nice fact sheets that really dispel a lot of those myths. So yes, there are some resources around. And there's some historic ones too. Nick Reed had a great little booklet on managing mistletoe that really put this information out there. So yes, there are resources around. Don't need to make them from scratch. So I'd say reach out to Laurie and the team at LLS, and they can get you set up with that.
Thanks, Dave. Yep, for sure. We'll send around a follow-up email to all the participants with those resources as well. Kevin, did you still have a question? Nope. Speak now. Yep, you've popped your hand up again. You should be able to speak, Kevin. Your microphone should be on at this end. If not, drop it in the Q&A if you can. If that's not working for you, you can drop us a line afterwards and we'll make sure we get an answer from the crew for you. But yeah, your mic should be enabled now. Otherwise, we're right on time. So we might look at wrapping up very shortly. I might hand over to Catherine. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you got something out of the webinar and learn a bit more about mistletoe and why it's a woodland superhero, and that you can now spread the word to other people. This was recorded, so it can be put up on the Hunter YouTube channel. And I'd like to especially thank Dave, Kristy, and Mick for giving up their time tonight, and also especially for Mick, because I know he's very busy. We'll also send round, when I send the email with the link to the YouTube, the obligatory feedback form. That is so that I can report what people thought of the webinar to our sponsors, I suppose, or funding that was received from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program. In the Hunter, we have a program bringing back the region honey eater, which funds lots of interesting things, including Birdlife to do some work and some of the surveys and work that's been done by Ross Crates. So I think if that's all, if no one's got any further questions, I'll sign off and let you go and finish your dinner or have a drink or whatever else you're going to do. Enjoy your night. Thank you.